Here. Start video. There it is. All right, I think we're good. All right, welcome once again to Medieval Times, where we're trying to see just what God was doing during all those hundreds of years, and about which we know very little, except a few snippets and a few words here and there, like Magna Carta and things like that. We started watching a video last time about the building of a castle, and it's an imaginary castle for the purposes of the video, as he explained, but it does represent what building a castle is like. And it takes place at the time period in which we find ourselves in our notes when we're looking at the advent of Edward the First. And I explained how he took over from his father, Henry III, was going on some crusades. When he returned home from that, his father had died and he became king. And he took over Wales, and in order to keep control, built castles there. And that's kind of the background of what's going on here in this video. So we'll continue now. I think you'll enjoy the rest of it. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, there we go.
In October of 1288, more than 5 years after Master James set out the first boundary markers, Aberwyvern Castle was finally completed. The entire outside of the castle was whitewashed, making it look as if it had been carved from a single gleaming piece of stone.
I have now turned my attention to the town. Only the English should be allowed to settle here at first, as His Majesty wants it to be an outpost in royalty in this rebellious region. And with the promise of low rents and other enticements, the town will attract a goodly number of established, industrious people. Then, once a person owns a house, he would certainly want to protect it if the town and castle were ever attacked.
I decided to settle in the town. And since I was one of the first, I got a building lot close to the well. Soon, houses spread all up and down the main streets. My house had a ground floor of packed earth covered with reeds. I covered the small window openings with oiled sheepskin to keep out the chill. And we depend upon our fire for both heat and light. Breeding and wool's been strong in Europe, they say. Now the hills outside of town are covered during the day with Aberwyvern sheep. We hope that as we continue to grow, Kenya will grant us a turn, so we can hold a yearly fair like the one at Chester. But bring merchants from all over, especially for our wool. Maybe we can tell you what's the scene. Way. Here is Thomas the shoemaker's shop, and over there's my close friend Oliver the tailor. Looks like he's opening up his shutters to start business for the day. As the number of shops increased, some locations have become a bit more desirable than others. Though we like him well enough, no one wants the spot behind Matthew the butcher's shop. Oh, that's Robert the barber's place. We aren't large enough for a full-time position, so we count on Robert to cure all manner of ills by bleeding out the bad humors. The man on north over there is Square. We'll take you right to the graves. Hey, mind the window! Well, Lord Kevin's servants on his way to the castle, and that's where I met too. Now that I'm an official, look there.
Andrew had a right to be proud of the new castle. Everyone in the town was impressed. But whether the elegant Lady Catherine would be impressed when she arrived was another matter entirely.
Being bound by the duties attendant upon my station in life, and being my lord's obedient wife, I knew there was no choice but to go and make the best of it. So on April 23rd, 1289, I arrived at the castle with my ladies in waiting, younger children, and servants.
Much of my married life had been away fighting wherever my king needed me. So Catherine has learned to manage the household on her own. She is as important to the proper functioning of our family and property as I am.
Master James and my lord spent 6 years making the castle the strongest in the land. I set myself to work making it as elegant and comfortable as a castle can possibly be. I insisted that Master James install fireplaces in every room of our living quarters, even though it was costly. I think it much to the family's benefit to relax in these smaller, warmer rooms, away from the drafts and noise of the great hall, particularly in the winter when everyone is cooped up inside. I hung the walls with beautiful tapestries from Normandy and Flanders. And I also brought our collection of books from which the tutor Philip teaches our children. I set a great store in education.
I oversee the training of our own soldiers, and when there's time, I often join them for riding or hunting.
I must oversee all the servants. And though the soldiers may have much leisure time, I can always find something for the servants to do.
I was working in the forge on a grave afternoon in May when a messenger arrived on horseback and asked to see Lord Kevin directly. Edward was coming for a visit in just a few days.
The soldiers been thrown into a frenzy of preparation. And as I think back longingly to those glittering visits to the royal court, I am determined to make His Majesty's stay one that will not soon be forgotten. First, there is the matter of cleaning the castle. All of it. Then, accommodation. Lord Kevin and I will relinquish our own apartment for the King's use. Of course, we in turn will move to the steward's quarters. He to the chamberlains, the chamberlain to the marshals to the butlers, and so on. The townspeople, meanwhile, are particularly excited about the royal arrival.
King Edward is making his entrance through town so that we can all catch a glimpse of His Royal Highness. Naturally, all business has started. It's about every day you get to see him. In the evening, we hold a great feast for His Majesty. Though the Welsh countryside has been relatively quiet, the king warned me that Prince David of Gwynedd is raising an army for an assault on all the English strongholds in Wales. His Majesty and I discussed strategy long into the night.
which dates from about the time of Lord Kevin's castle, is a fairly accurate representation of medieval warfare. Battles were usually small, and the black radio between knights and their aides and squires. Pause. Just as in the game, your opponent wasn't so much the object as cornering him and leaving him without options. Let's get back to the real thing. This is Harlem, one of Edward's castles that actually went through a bloody siege. In those days, this was the dry moat, and in order to reach the gatehouse, you climbed the causeway and crossed the drawbridge, very much the way I placed it at Aberwyvern. The whole concept of castle construction was to give the defender every possible advantage, and that began with the high ground on which they built. If there happened to be water on the mountains too, so much the better.
Even today, it looks impregnable.
And during the rebellion of 1294, only 37 men held off an entire army here. First defense was the drawbridge. Spanned the moat and connected to the end of the causeway. There were weights under this end. And when the supports were pulled out, this end dropped down into a pit and that end swung up.
But even if you could get across the moat, when the bridge was up, it became a solid dome.
That's right. And there were also soldiers on either side of the gatehouse and above the main entrance.
Oh, yes, I see.
They were also protected by heavy wooden doors. And behind each pair of doors was a heavy oak drawbar, which slid across here and into that slot over there. A portcullis slid up and down in these grooves. Arrows could be shot through here. A second portcullis was here, a second pair of doors was here, and another drawbar across here. Now, if for any reason an attacking army was able to break through the gate, Sarah, you be the Welsh army and attack my castle.
I don't know about that. So it's to be English against Welsh again, is it?
Just to make a point, for the sake of history.
I think I'd rather have your part. David,
I'm all ready for you.
I think I know how to.
You've made it through the outer gate.
Assuming I could.
Master James was trying to make sure you couldn't, but let's say you did.
Very well, I battered my way.
So you have. And as soon as you did, I dropped the portcullis behind you. Now you're trapped between two portcullises. My archers can get you through the arrow loops. Checkmate. Now I can dump boiling water, burning coals, stones, possibly even a dead cat on you through this opening, called a murder hole.
I can see why.
You can also see what a mess you'd be in.
Well, of course, you had all the advantages.
That's what King Edward was paying for.
But let's say you enough not to come through the gate, and you think of a wooden siege tower up against the wall.
Then I dump burning straw down on you and set the tower on fire.
All right then, two can play at this game. What if I just sit outside and wait for you to start?
Well, I might get hungry after a while. Don't forget, I've got reinforcements on the way.
Then let's slide down a tunnel under the castle wall and take him by surprise.
You'd be very good generals for me.
Then that is the best way.
I didn't say that. All of these methods were difficult and risky, including that one. But the fact that they were even tried says something about the tremendous strength of these castles.
Well, if they had to be built that strong, it must also say something about the spirit and determination of the Welsh people.
Absolutely right. They were a fiercely proud, brave, and independent people. And any English monarch who forgot that did so at his own peril. As part of his program in 1284, King Edward I named his son, who was born at Carnarvon, to be the first Prince of Wales.
And ever since that time, the eldest son of every English monarch has had the title of Prince of Wales.
Sarah, do you know what the king's first gift to his son was?
Let me guess. A toy castle.
You've got it. Let's get on with our story. Throughout the night, Lord Kevin's soldiers stood watch from the highest towers, while merchants, craftsmen, and farmers took turns manning the town wall. in the waters around the castle, Welsh ships prevented escape or new supplies reaching the English. And as the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, Prince Davith and his troops grimly marched toward Aberwyvern.
We destroyed them. Pardon? Livestock farms, farmhouses, all the grain fields. It's some of the presence of the first thing discovered. We reached the town wall. We fought toward the
A few fortunate townspeople made it into the castle ahead of their Welsh pursuers, who were trapped in the gateway between the portcullises. From high atop the gatehouse tower to the inner ward, Lord Kevin watched the destruction and slaughter.
If I could only send forces up to help the brave townsmen on the front line. But if I leave the castle without defences, the whole siege will be lost. And with the Welsh army closing in, they cannot open the gates for any more people escaping the carnage. But now, the battle has come to us.
Outside the castle walls, Davith's men assembled in force, preparing their siege towers and catapults. Inside the castle, archers stood poised, ready to unleash the first wave of arrows as the attackers came within their range.
My plan has been to cut off the castle from the land while our ships cut it off from the sea, and to starve Kevin into surrender. But when my messenger came with news that King Edward had dispatched a large force from the north, I knew we could not wait.
They reached the wall. As one attacker fell, another took his place. Boulders, boiling water and arrows kept some away. He blocked directly on the point of a sword or axe.
My sappers were digging a tunnel for the wall.
Inside the inner ward, part of the barracks became a hospital as the wounded were brought down from the walls. The fighting continued without let up for 3 days as each exhausted ship was replaced by the next.
This morning, news has reached me that the troops of King Edward are less than a day away. Now we must make a final move. I am ordering that.
But throughout it all, my castle remained secure and impenetrable, and the wall over the Seventh Tunnel proved too strong and thick to fall. The Welsh attackers had done their worst, but they were no match for our castle's defenses. It knows the advantage is now mine.
We have no way of smashing their defences before the English reinforcements arrive. The best we can put for is a stalemate to keep Kevin in check. We have no voice. We will need greater strength to drive these cursed English from our homeland. Until we do, the struggle will never cease. We know that God unites us.
There were more battles over Aberwyvern, but in the years that followed, Welsh families began to take up residence outside the town wall. During fairs and on market days, they came in to sell and trade their goods. Eventually, Welsh and English lived side by side, and the town became too large for the wall that enclosed it. When the Welsh became part of the business life of the area, the castle built to subdue them became unnecessary. Thus, the full measure of King Edward's victory wasn't achieved until almost 200 years after his death. By that time, Lord Kevin's mighty fortress stood empty and roofless from neglect. And when travelers came to ask directions to Aberwyvern, they meant not the derelict old castle, but the thriving town. There weren't many castles built in Britain during the 14th century. There was neither the resources nor the need. Wales was successfully, though reluctantly, brought under English rule, and the next steps had to be economic, social, rather than military. The great age of English and European castle building was, for the most part, over.
The 13th century, remarkable for its scholastic, economic, judicial, and architectural achievements, faded into a 14th century of more frequent wars, disease, famine, and disorganization. By the end of the 1300s, the European population had been cut nearly in half by an enemy the people of the Middle Ages dreaded far more than all the armies the most powerful princes could muster: the Black Death. No castle wall could keep out the plague, a terrifying infectious disease that spread through Europe beginning in 1348.
Nor could any castle withstand the introduction of gunpowder, cannon, and other improvements to the business of war making. So England's castles were abandoned and ignored, except by local builders who used them as quarries for stone. The great castle here at Conway which happens to be my favorite, is still a powerful and stirring reminder of the past in the midst of this bustling town.
I can't help thinking that in the nearly 700 years since Edward's time, so much has changed. Methods of warfare, outlooks on life. But these castles are still here. I wonder if anything in our own civilization will last as long.
In spite of the romantic images they conjure up, we mustn't overlook the fact that castles symbolize a long-standing and less flattering human trait, man's apparently insatiable desire for conflict and conquest. But in these castles, there is an optimistic irony, perhaps even a lesson to be learned. For as impressive as the ruins are, they are, after all, ruins, neglected machines of war surrounded by life, a life they helped create, but which has survived them, and which continues to flourish long after each invincible fortress quickly and quietly succumbed to obsolescence.
I hope you enjoyed that. One thing I like about it is he gives a lot of insight into how people lived, as well as just, not just the castle itself. Do you have any questions or comments about what we saw on the video?
Was the class that black leg or?
Oh, we're going to talk about that later. It's one of the topics that we'll cover closer to the time that it occurred when we get there. So yeah, we will talk about that. Any other? Oh, thank you. Any other comments or questions?
Any castles today operated, or are they historical, like?
Yeah, most
museums, or-
of the ones that I have seen, I think all the ones I've seen are in ruins. Some of them are museums. Some have been repurposed. I know the castle that my wife's Scottish ancestors owned, called the Leslie Castle, is now used as a bed and breakfast. My son was able to see it when he was in Scotland. What's the most famous castle of all?
Leslie.
In the world?
Buckingham Palace.
Okay, that I wasn't thinking about that one. It's the one probably more famous than that. Everybody in the world knows this castle. The one at Disneyland or Disney World,
Right,
which was patterned after Neuschwanstein.
right.
And that castle was not built for defensive purposes. You know the history of that? It was built, I think it was in the 18th century, I think it was. Long past when castles were of any value. He just wanted to build a really cool castle, and he did. And Disney fashioned his after that one. And that is, I would say, function. I mean, not that anybody lives there, but it is a museum. You can walk through and see it all.
If I remember right, he never lived there. He never
That's
finished
quite
in his
possible.
lifetime. Yeah, he lived in Ludwigsburg.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a palace there, and that's the difference between a castle and a palace. There's a palace there that you can also see. Yeah, that's all in Germany. I didn't mention that. Any other comments or questions?
It's interesting to see how the cultural and the intellectual cultures of the day were made intact to the castle. That was the king who had the knowledge, had the power, disseminated it. Today, 50 years ago, we had newspapers and radios. Now it's the internet.
Mhm.
But how the control of thought was dispersed, and what an important role a castle would play in it.
Yeah, and think what happened then as he related to bring about the demise of that superstructure fortress. What brought about the demise? Was it a military army? No, it was that the people who lived in that area became acclimated to the people who invaded, and they were living at peace, and there was no need for a castle anymore.
A good video, though. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah. This guy does good work. There is a book also, I think came first before the video, called The Castle, by the same person. You can find it online certainly, or in stores. If you were here when we did Egypt in ancient times, we also watched a video by the same guy, David Macaulay, and he has a book on pyramid. And in the future, we'll watch one about the building of a cathedral.
What's that guy's name?
David Macaulay, I think I'm saying his name right. I don't have it written down here. I think it's Macauley, something like that. Maybe somebody could look it up on the internet while we're waiting and see if that's correct. It's something called the Castle, I believe, or the Pyramid. Okay, let's move on then. Having looked at Edward the First and his intrusion, if you will, into Wales and the building of castles, and we're not finished with Edward. He accomplished some other things too. In fact, his most important contribution was the development of Parliament. Everyone's heard of Parliament, you know what that is in England. Now, English kings had always had a group of advisors. The Anglo-Saxon kings had what was called the Witan, W-I-T-A-N. I've mentioned them before in earlier times we've had together. William the Conqueror established, let's review real quickly. William the Conqueror, from where did he come?
Normandy.
Normandy. And in what year did he conquer Angleland? Earlier? What? 1066. All right. And anybody remember the name of the guy that he conquered who claimed the throne that William also claimed and died in the battle? Well, what was the name of the battle? I remember that. Hastings, good. And what was the name of the guy that was killed who enabled William to take over?
Harold something.
Harold. That's good enough. Harold, which was also the name of the Viking invader that Harold had defeated earlier. Okay, so good. You guys remembered more than I imagine. What's that?
More than what we gave the credit for.
Well, I mean, I've asked questions before and was met with crickets. So, you know, not because this it's hard to remember all this stuff, and so I'm glad that you remembered something. Well, William the Conqueror established what was called the Great Council, the Curia Regis, or King's Council. Edward enlarged the membership of the Great Council to include representative knights from every shire and representative burgesses, which is a word for citizens, from every town. So when we fast forward to America in the early 1600s, does anybody know the first permanent settlement, English settlement in America? No, before Plymouth. Actually, it's the late 1500s. Jamestown. And Jamestown was under martial law until 1619, when they had settled down enough not to need that anymore, and they established a representative government in that year. And the first representative legislature in American history was established at Jamestown, and it was called, anybody know? The House of Burgesses. House of Burgesses. And it goes back to the term that was used at the time of Edward, as he included representative burgesses, that is, people who live in burgs. And we have burg at the end of a lot of our city names: Harrisburg, Pittsburgh. You know, those are come from German and English background to indicate a town. And so a person who lives in a burg is a burgess. So he included membership of this council to include, let me repeat, representative knights from every shire. That would be the equivalent of a county for us, and representative burgesses from every town. And it came to be called a French word, parliament. The word parliament is French for to speak or to discuss. In the 14th century, a little later on, members of parliament started to meet in two separate groups. The chief vassals met in one group that became known as the House of Lords. Remember, there were lords and vassals under them, and then those vassals were lords of the vassals under them. Well, so those groups of lords were organized in one chamber of parliament called the House of Lords. The knights and burgesses met in another group that became known as the House of Commons, because they represented the community, common community. A parliament was gradually transformed from just an advisory body to a legislative body through the use of the power of the purse. Anybody have an idea what that means? The power of the purse. It's not a lady hitting you with it.
Something the House of Representatives doesn't do.
Well, that's what they're supposed to do, though. Yeah. House of Representatives has the power of the purse. What does that mean? Yeah, it has to do with spending. Now, our House of Representatives has the power of the purse in that all financial decisions have to begin there, or any laws dealing with spending have to begin in the House of Representatives. For Parliament, it was the authority to approve or disapprove new taxes desired by the king. So in that case, it began with the king, and Parliament had to approve it, because Parliament then, representing all of the shires and burgs would be the ones who would be collecting the taxes or enforcing the collection of those taxes. The king really couldn't do it without them, and so they began to gain a little more power that way. And that's the power of the purse. Just in case we're not sure about the location of places we talked about, this is England as we look at Great Britain, and this is Wales. So this was the area where Edward I was building his castles. And as you look at it today, here's Scotland to the north and Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, and Wales make up what's called Great Britain. And then the Republic of Ireland is separate. They're not connected with Great Britain, or sometimes called the British Isles. All right, any questions about anything we've just said? All right, next we want to go over to France. In France, we have a family called the Capetians, who are named after Hugh Capet, C-A-P-E-T, and a royal house was established there. As you remember, back when Charlemagne became the ruler over what we call France today, and remember, his successors did not do a very good job, and they lost control. The Carolingian Empire, as it was called, broke up into many realms. In 987, so we're backing up a little bit here from where we were in England, the feudal lords chose the Count of Paris, Hugh Capet, as their king, thus establishing a new royal line, the Capetian house. The Capetians were able to steadily increase their power over the feudal lords by the following factors. First, for over 300 years, every Capetian king had a son to succeed him. Therefore, there were no wars of succession. Now, that's extremely important. Even in the Bible, where you see that the northern kingdom of Israel doesn't have a succession, there are lots of assassinations and wars because there's no one to take the throne. Whereas in the southern kingdom, it continues to be in the line of David, going to an eldest son, and there always was one. But for the Capetians, They were able to maintain power because they continually had a son to take over as king. And here are the first three kings of the Capetian dynasty. Actually, there's 6 there. And so that would enable them to keep control. Secondly, the Capetian rulers enlarged their royal possessions by conquest and through marriage alliances. So here we see the territorial conquests of King Philip II of France. If you look back at this one, you see that he comes after the ones that are there. So King Philip II, 1180, the areas that were controlled by the king are in green, and the red is actually areas controlled by the King of England, as you may remember. But by 1223, the kings of France, the Capetian kings, had taken over most of what is present-day France. So that's the second thing that helped them to steadily increase power. The third was they developed an effective system of centralized government. An effective system of centralized government. You know, one of the things that causes governments to fall is their ineffectiveness, you know, not being good at what they do. You know, a lot of times that's due to whoever's in control giving power to people who are incompetent because they're relatives or because they buy an office. And those that do better are those that give offices to those that are good at it. The Capetian dynasty did a good job of making the system efficient. And fourthly, the Capetians found valuable allies in the church and townspeople, winning financial independence from the great feudal lords. You know, as a king, who is your greatest threat? It's the feudal lords who can maybe band together and go against you. But if you have the church on your side and the townspeople think you're treating them right, then the feudal lords don't have much to gain. They can't get people to help them. All right, so the Capetian dynasty continued for quite some time. Let's look specifically then at Philip II. Philip II was the one who took the holdings of the Capetians from a small area around Paris, which was struggling to maintain control of their feudal holdings, and was able to continue to expand what they controlled. With the reign of Louis VI, the 5th Capetian king, the French king became master of his royal domain. So it was over what we consider France. That takes us then to Philip II. Let me go back to so we can see. Yeah, those guys aren't on there. They're later than that. Philip II, also called Augustus. He's from 1180 to 1223. Greatly enlarged his territory and increased his power over his vassals, initiating a period of Capetian greatness. He's considered the true founder of France. So all of his ancestors in the Capetian line kind of led up to what he was able to accomplish then as king over France. The chief obstacle to the expansion of royal power in France was, as we said before, the large amount of land held by the English kings. Although the Plantagenets, that was the name of the family of English kings, were vassals of the French king because their land was in a vassal relationship to the King of France. Their land holdings in France far exceeded those ruled directly by the French king. Unsuccessful against kings Henry II and Richard the Lionhearted, found an opportunity against King John when he refused to stand trial in Philip's court in a dispute between John and one of his French vassals. So what happened essentially is that King John has land in France. One of his vassals had a complaint, and so they were to come to the court of Philip in order to settle the dispute, and John refused to come. So that put him in contempt of court, if you will. And so Philip declared John's French lands forfeited, losing to Philip then Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, tripling the size of his own royal domain. Philip also increased the effectiveness of royal government, replacing local feudal officials with new royal ones called baillis, or we would say bailiffs, or we would call it rarely comes across in English as bailiffs. We know what a bailiff is. A little different back then. The king appointed and paid these bailiffs. They were the ones then that collected the royal taxes, enforced feudal rights, administered justice, and reinforced the king's authority throughout his realm. So that was effective because no longer do you have a bunch of different people all over the place collecting taxes. No one knows what anybody else is doing. The king now has control of that through his bailli. One major setback occurred for Philip II in his relationship with, oops, I forgot to put the things that the bailli did. They collected royal taxes, enforced feudal rights, and administered justice. Like so many at the time, Philip had trouble with Pope Innocent III. We've heard his name a number of times. The Pope seized every opportunity to intervene in the affairs of the European states. Philip had his recent marriage to a Danish princess annulled by the French bishops. It seems like so many of the conflicts come about because of marriages, and this is no different. Predictably, Innocent refused to recognize this annulment and excommunicated Philip and placed France under an interdict. Sound familiar? He did the same thing with King John, didn't he? Philip was forced to back down, taking back his Danish wife, but also putting away another wife whom he had married in the meantime. Next, we come to Louis IX. Louis IX was the grandson of Philip, and he's been called the ideal medieval king. He combined sincere piety and just rule to build respect and loyalty for the French throne. One of the great things that he did, if you want to read, is a letter he wrote to his son Philip, summarizing the spiritual standards of the medieval knight and ruler. And I won't read you the entire letter, but he felt it was necessary because medieval knights did not always behave in an exemplary Christian fashion. For example, the cult of romantic love that had developed in Europe by then often encouraged adultery. And one 1400s writer complained that knights set places on fire, robbed churches, and imprisoned priests. So Louis begins by pointing to Philip's relationship with God. That's where he begins his letter to his son. He then turns to the duties of rulers and points out the different things that a good Christian ruler ought to do. He then concludes with the ultimate motivation. He says this: I pray our Lord Jesus Christ, by his mercy, to guard, protect you from doing anything contrary to his will, and to give you the grace to do it always, so that he may be honored and served by you. And this may he do to me as to you by his great bounty, so that after this mortal life we may be together with him in eternal life, and see him, love him, and praise him without end. Amen. That's a great ending to the letter, and the rest of the letter is pretty good too. And if you are interested, look it up online. The letter of Philip II, I'm sorry, the letter of Louis IX to his son Philip. Concerned about the welfare of his subjects, Louis IX made peace and justice the primary goals of his reign. In the 1240s, Louis IX ordered all nobles who were vassals of both the English king and the French king to renounce one or the other. You got to pick a side. From that time on, quarrels between the French and English kings lost their feudal character and became increasingly nationalistic. He also led 2 failed crusades. He's pictured here on the right in a crusader outfit. These crusades, of course, were against the Muslims. The ones he went on were in North Africa. On the first one, Louis took 36 ships with 15,000 men to Egypt. After an initial victory, an epidemic forced their retreat from advancing on Cairo. The king suffered so badly from dysentery that he cut a hole in the back of his pants and marched with the rear guard. No pun intended. The Muslims captured him. I don't know if it's because he was at the back or not, but most of his men were massacred. He and a few nobles were released after they paid a ransom that was so high that it reportedly took 2 days to count the gold. The defeat plunged him into despair and deeper piety. He blamed himself for the loss, believing God was punishing him for his sins. He began dressing plainly, eating simply, and helping the poor. After his release, Louis went to the Holy Land, where he spent 4 years building walls and towers around several coastal cities and endeavoring to make treaties with the Muslims, wanting to guarantee the safety of pilgrims traveling to various holy places. His negotiations were interrupted by the death of his mother, who had been acting as his regent in his absence from France. He contracted an illness on the Second Crusade 22 years later, which led to his death. He died while lying penitentially on a bed of ashes, whispering the name of the city he never won, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. He is remembered as Saint Louis or Saint Louis, the only king of France named a saint by the Roman Catholic Church, and after whom our city is named, I believe. Okay, any questions about Louis? Saint Louis. All right, we'll continue with the Capetians and go to Philip IV. Philip IV strengthened the organization and authority of the central government and greatly increased the taxation of the French people. Because of his increasing need for revenue, Philip went a step further and taxed the French clergy as well. He even ordered the arrest of all Templars in France in order to acquire their enormous wealth and property. In order to justify this, he accused them of sodomy, blasphemy, and heresy. For the Templars, the situation worsened in November 1307, when Pope Clement V ordered the arrest of all Templars in England, Aragon, Castile, and Cyprus. Then in 1310, 54 Templars in Paris were burned at the stake. Finally, at the Council of Vienna in 1312, the Templars were officially disbanded and their property transferred to the Hospitallers. Jacques de Molay, the last Templar Grand Master, was burned at the stake in 1314. And you can read what it says about him there. Now, that would appear to be the end of the Templars. But David has studied them and knows that they continued to have a great influence after that. Do you want to add anything at this point as to how they continued on, and whether you think the accusations were justified, or was it just trying to get their money?
Well, what I've studied, I think there was some justification to it.
And how did they survive this? Because it looks like they're going after them all.
They went underground, went into Portugal, eventually into England. They met, kept meeting under, in underground.
Secret, yeah.
Secret meetings. But eventually they wanted a way to meet slightly more publicly that wasn't quite so secretive. So they infiltrated, what did I say? A club or whatever, that,
Now, were they associated with the Masons?
yes,
But that-
they infiltrated the Mason groups in England.
The guild.
Yeah, the guilds, that's what I want to say.
Hmm.
So that they could use that as a cover. That's kind of how they just kept it going. I mean,
And can you give your best answer to the question as to what was their goal? And maybe then what did that goal change over the centuries? Is it as simple as saying world domination, or is it
well,
something?
it was all financial from what I understand.
Yeah,
I mean, right from the very get-go, I don't know, but somewhere along the way, they developed the first banking system.
Hmm.
And from what I've heard, the journey from Europe to the Middle East for the Crusades is very dangerous.
Yeah.
And so they developed a way, they opened multiple offices. And if you were gonna go on a crusade, you could go to them and turn in your possessions, hand it over to them in Europe. And they wrote you a piece of paper. And when you got to your destination in the Middle East with your paper, then they would give you the money back.
sounds like the first checking system.
Yeah, what they didn't tell the people is that very high percentage of the people died on the way and never made it. And so they had already turned the possessions over to them. When these people died, their widow had no claim on it, their sons had no claim on it. So they started amassing huge amounts of wealth.
Hmm.
And it got very corrupt.
Yeah, sounds like it. Okay. There's a lot of interesting things about the Templars, and David's given us some really good information there. But let's go on to one more character here, and that is Pope Boniface VIII. Finally, Innocent III passes from the scene, and we come to Pope Boniface VIII. He was described by one of his successors as, and this is the kind of description you want for the religious leader. He was described as a horrid monster and a man who in criminality surpassed all the rest of mankind. There's the vicar of the church. He decreed that no king could impose a tax on clergy, and that's what Philip was doing. Philip countered by refusing to allow gold and silver to be exported from France. So there is that battle between them, because the gold and silver was what the papacy was depending on, and so that countermeasure by Philip decreased greatly the papal revenues, which of course caused the Pope to be even more upset. In 1302, Philip IV, also called Philip the Fair of France, publicly burned Pope Boniface VIII's bull called Asculta Filii, which called on Philip IV to mend his ways. Bull is simply a letter, and we'll see several of those in history to come. In this and other controversies with the Pope, Philip had the support of the French people, which is extremely important. Their loyalty gradually shifted away from the church and the papacy to the state and the French king. So this is a time when you could call it incipient nationalism. There's beginning to be a nationalistic sense among people that I don't belong to just this little duchy here or there. I belong to France. I am a Frenchman, and the Pope is taking money from us. And so the religious value of being a Roman Catholic started to be outweighed by being a Frenchman and having loyalty to the king. And of course, that's going to continue on for several centuries until it comes to a point where there can be rebellion against the Pope, as we'll come to. To strengthen popular support for his policies, Philip summoned representatives from the church, nobility, and townspeople to meet in Paris. The meetings of these three states or classes became known as the Estates General. Estates is our word for states and refers to levels of society. And so these are the three estates, the church, nobility, and townspeople. And you can see there's the third estate representing the townspeople is the largest in the pyramid. The second estate is the nobility, and then the first estate was the clergy. There was the fewest. Those are the three that were representative. This group at this time had a purely advisory capacity, but it was a way for the king to at least have them feel that they were having a part in the government. And but still, the monarchy had no restraints upon its growth into an absolute monarchy. But it is the beginning of what eventually will become a force that will reckon themselves against the king as we get up into the 18th century. All right, any questions about the French development as the Capetian line gains power, unifies France to a great degree, and then as we have the conflict with the Pope and the establishment of the Estates General. All right, next week we're going to get to what you've all been waiting for, maybe.
Fishy Swan.
No. The Crusades. Doesn't everybody always want to know about the Crusades? Or am I wrong? All right, yeah, we'll talk about the Crusades, and even though it covers a lot of years, some of which we've already gone over, we're going to look at it all at once. So next week will be the Crusades. Any final questions or comments?
It's good, good date there for Boniface.
Well, it was late 1200s, early 1300s. 1302 is when he issued a bull against Philip IV.
Yeah, thank you.
Which is before the Templars were attacked. Just a little bit before that. But close, yeah. Anything else? We're going to find, once we get past the Crusades, I think, as we move more into the 14th century, that's going to be a huge time period. There's going to be a lot of things that develop during the 14th century. It's going to be very interesting as we move along. Okay, if that's all for this week, then we will stop there and pick it up next time with the Crusades.